Okay, we are in the historic city of Baltimore, Maryland, going to explore and see just a cannon shot from an entire naval battle of the history that lies throughout the city and the Chesapeake Bay. That is right behind us. We are currently standing in Inner Harbor, right in downtown. Today we will see how the Revolutionary War, Fort McHenry, War of 1812, and the United States National Anthem, also known as the Star Spangled Banner, are all linked into one historic venture. Let's get started with the Revolutionary War. The year is 1763, and the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, has just concluded, guaranteeing all French land east of the Mississippi to be a part of the current British colonies. Due to the expenses of a long war far from the mainland of Britain and the need of constant military presence throughout the colonies, expenses were growing. This was done through a series of increasing taxes and cost-cutting measures like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, and a whole lot others. With each set of new taxes and laws being released, just increased the amount of black powder ready to blast through the colonies and start a revolution. By 1770, the country was just a few more grains away from filling a powder keg full of black powder and received a crate full with the Boston Massacre taking place, setting the newspapers ablaze throughout the colonies, becoming a major stepping stone in helping the colonies start working together just 2 years later in 1772, creating the Committees of Correspondence. This was done to try and use the weight of all the colonies together and try to influence the British to lessen all of these new laws. The following year, a Tea Act was enacted, followed up with the Boston Tea Party. By 1775, the lit wick had burnt to the black powder, and the Revolutionary War would commence. The British would use their overpowering navy to blockade all of the soon-to-be United States ports, including the entirety of the Chesapeake Bay. And a fort was hastily built looking over the entrance of the harbor, which is right behind us. So this area was chosen to be the perfect location to defend it. The primitive defensive structure was just built out of earthen embankments, more or less, known as Fort Whetstone. As you can see right behind us here, this is more or less what the fort originally had looked like. We are currently on the outskirts of Fort McHenry, looking at more or less what it originally would have looked like during the Revolutionary War. This fort would stay occupied and ready for an attack that would never come. And by 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the American Revolution, banding the colonies together and forming a new nation. So let's head deeper into the fort and explore deeper into this cool historic venture. The fort would see some significant renovations starting in 1798, turning the earthen fort that we were just looking at into what's right behind us. Significant upgrades, with a lot of the interior of the fort being built out of brick and stones, so it was able to house and store modern weaponry and even take hits from it as well. This imposing star-shaped fort would go through a name change while the renovations were happening. Now named Fort McHenry after George Washington's Secretary of War. The renovations were finalized by 1803 and would become the home of one of the few artillery units in the new United States military. But this currently quiet fort would become the home of one of America's most famous battles during the War of 1812. And to understand why the War of 1812 started, we need to backtrack just a little bit to the year of 1789, all the way over in France. The French public grew increasingly tired of the increasingly oppressive monarchy, with food shortages, higher taxes, and a whole lot more going on within the government and throughout the country. With a massive crowd of people storming the Bastille in July of 1789, signifying a major turning point in the French Revolution. By 1793, the monarchy was outright more or less abolished, and the country was run by a national convention. During this time, many European monarchs were frightful of this power change, looking to outright suppress it so this doesn't spread throughout Europe. European powers like Britain, Prussia, and Austria took arms against France, and the French Revolutionary Wars had begun. With these wars lasting all the way up until 1799, ending in a momentary peace, and unfortunately sparking back up more or less later that year, and lasting all the way up until 1815, called the Neapolitan Wars. This was when Napoleon had more or less taken over France and started his conquests across Europe. Now, so you might be asking yourself, what in the world does all this have to do with the newly formed United States? Let's go see how. The United States wanted to stay neutral in the European conflicts during these wars because it didn't have anything to do with them, really. This remained true through the first set of wars until Napoleon seized power in France during 1799. The short peace between France and Britain would end by 1803, but become a very different war that would be hard to stay neutral in. Not only were major naval and ground battles occurring in and around France, so were major economic wars between the two powers, leading to the British openly seizing American trade vessels and sailors to incorporate them within their fleet. This led the U.S. to basically be forced into a trade war at first with Britain to try and stop the abuse of power. But all this did was drag both countries closer to war. With each month passing and tensions slowly rising, someone was going to need to budge and put ink to parchment for an official war declaration. The first strike was the United States, with a declaration of war passing in June of 1812 and Britain quickly following up. The War of 1812 has now begun. The British well outclassed the American Navy with over 500 ships, compared to the United States only housing 16 at the time. Quickly realizing a naval war would end in a swift loss, the United States wanted to play a ground war, forcing the British into land skirmishes, giving U.S. troops a home field advantage. With the initial ground plan to attack up into Canada, to capture land for leverage when negotiating peace once the war was over. This quickly stalled out due to the high numbers of native tribes supplied by the British to help defend their land, creating a stalemate in the region. Much of the war was back and forth for the first couple years until 1814, when Napoleon was defeated in Europe, allowing Britain to send much of its military over to the United States to try and end this war once and for all. To try and destroy the American morale, they set their sight on Washington, D.C. and some of the surrounding cities to bring pressure off of the Great Lakes region, landing troops in Maryland far from D.C., quickly moving in and crushing American resistance in the city. The military set fire to most of the government buildings within the city and quickly left to take Baltimore, which is one of the most important ports in the region. Let's head over to Fort McHenry and see how this went. And here we are, the pinnacle of today's historic venture, Fort McHenry, at the mouth of the Baltimore Harbor, currently acting as a national monument and that anyone can visit and explore its historic battle-torn grounds today. After D.C. had been sacked in August of 1814, the British were closing in on Baltimore, where the American defending forces were scrambling to construct defenses around the city. The first battle would take place around the outskirts of the Battle of North Point, designed to slow down the advance and buy Baltimore just a little bit more time to prepare. This plan went perfectly. Even though the British forces won, the American forces did their job by inflicting many casualties, forcing them to slow down. By the time the British Army arrived, it was too late, due to the American forces building a considerable defensive line along the city, with a large defending force of almost 10,000 infantry and about 100 artillery. Realizing charging into these defenses at Hampstead Hill would most likely end in a catastrophic loss for the British Army, the commander decided they would need artillery support from the Navy stationed just outside of the harbor, right down this way, down that way, just outside a distance, to come on up. But to do this, they would need to break past Fort McHenry, which is where we're standing at right now. The last line of defense for the city of Baltimore would need to hold out against the might of the British Navy. The Battle of Baltimore is officially on in September of 1814. Just behind us, the mouth of Inner Harbor, merchant ships were purposely sunk to slow down the British Navy's advance near this fort to help make sure it was at its most effective in the battle. An attack plan by the British was laid out to blow the enemy out of Fort McHenry, using everything the ships could throw at them, and pummel the 1,000 men to rubble or to surrender. The troops within the fort, commanded by George Armstead, had a very different plan. The British sent in their mortars and newly developed rocket ships in to pound the fort starting September 13th. And now something really cool with the design of this fort, it was built to take hits from these mortars and cannon fire. Right in this room that we're standing in has a few feet of concrete, a brick layer, and over 10 feet of earth. This was built to protect the stores of gunpowder to fire off the cannons. And if you look around here, all of these entrances on our right and on our left here are curved in when it comes down. These were purposely built this way so that if any shells were to go off exploding, no shrapnel would be able to come down and hit the stores below, creating a massive explosion. But because of how this was built, that couldn't happen. The British sent in their mortar and newly developed rocket ships in to pound the fort starting September 13th. Some of the other ships sat back and watched the show, including one housing a lawyer named Francis Scott Key, negotiating a prisoner release from the British. Now, something awesome with this fort is that they still have a lot of the original cannons and equipment throughout this area. Just being here and seeing just the absolute size of these cannons, I can imagine these things shooting off, like the concussion that would come off. It would probably, you just feel it in your chest. It's so cool. And most of these cannons on the fort had a little over a mile range outside of here. So a lot of the British ships would sit just outside of the range once the battle kind of started, which for both sides was very limiting. A lot of the British warships with the heavier cannons couldn't get close enough to hit here because that would be in range of these cannons. So that's why they used mainly rocket and mortar ships to try and outrange them. And also there's only very specific points in this harbor those ships could go through. And the main deep channel those ships would go through would take you right here next to the fort, which would basically spell disaster for those British ships. With how heavily built this fort was, it was built to take on the largest and biggest cannons of the time. And those little mortars and rockets didn't really do almost anything to these walls while they were going off. For over 24 hours, the onslaught of rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air constantly pounded the grounds of Fort McHenry. With all the occupants could do was wait out the attack and prepare for the worst, since the ship sat just outside the cannon's range. As day became night and night became day, no soul budged. The defenders held firm. It was either lose Baltimore or save it. Thousands of shells and rockets were launched at the fort. Quite a few missing just because of the range that the ships were forced to fire from. And throughout the night, the weather was not really ideal for this kind of battle. Cold temperatures and a lot of rain would hamper any amphibious landing from happening with the cover of this artillery. As the morning sun warmed the battered grounds, the cannons halted to see if the fort was still operating. As the smoke and fog slowly dissipated, a massive American flag was raised to show they were still there, placing the battered, war-torn one from the bombardment of the night before. Fort McHenry had taken minimal damage due to all of the well-done, quick preparations and the other upgrades finished up a few years earlier. With how well the American forces held, the British pulled out from Baltimore to head south to Louisiana, where another major battle takes place that we can visit on another day, becoming a major morale boost to the Americans due to the loss of Washington and stalemate up north in the Great Lakes region. This win becomes a major turning point in the war and considerably helps bring both nations closer to peace. Once the battle ended, Francis Scott Key would create a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry that would be renamed later on to the Star Spangled Banner, being adopted as the United States national anthem in March of 1931. The War of 1812, also known as the Second War for Independence, due to its officially legitimizing the United States, showing it can take on a world power like Britain, gaining respect with many of the major powers of the time. The Treaty of Ghent was ratified by both countries, ending the war in early 1815. with some skirmishes like the Battle of New Orleans still occurring afterwards, since the message didn't really get out in time to those respective areas. Fort McHenry would go through upgrades over the years, being used in the Civil War and finally losing its constant garrison in 1912. It would later be used to help in both World Wars as training grounds and a temporary hospital. Today, it sits as a reminder to the war that brought the United States to the world stage and created its most iconic song. So that's where we end today. I hope you enjoyed our history venture, exploring some new stories in a very different part of the country. We saw how the Revolutionary War, Fort McHenry, War of 1812, and United States National Anthem, also known as the Star Spangled Banner, are all linked into one historic venture. So, I'll see you on the next one.